Okay, there you go. Okay, so that should have started the recording. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the event on rethinking education from the Kyoto School of Philosophy. Also the launch of my book. Welcome. My name's Anton Sevilla-Liu, Associate Professor at Kyushu University, and I'm hosting this event. And we also have our two speakers, Takaya Sensei and Catherine, who I'll introduce in a bit. So, just our schedule for today, if my PowerPoint would cooperate with me, it would be very nice. Please give me a second to figure out. Ooh, there you go. Okay, it's live. Okay. Our schedule for today, um, until 6:10 Japan time, we'll have some opening remarks and then we'll do three talks. So we'll have first Catherine Sibielio on Nishihira's philosophy of no mind and type 2 learning. And then we'll have Takaya Sensei on Nishida's education for awakening or I&U relationship between Nishida and Kimura. And then the third one will be mine, abstract, applied, and reconstructive philosophy, the method of Japanese philosophies of education. So each of these talks will be maybe around 20 minutes presentation and then 10 minutes to discuss. And then for the last 20 minutes, we'll have an open discussion with all three presenters. Okay, so just a bit of an introduction. So, the opportunity for this event is the launch of my book. It just arrived actually today, this afternoon. I finally have a copy of my book, but the cover's there, on the screen. It's entitled Japanese Philosophies of Education, Watsuji, Tetsurō, and Mori Akira. So, my thanks to everyone who was involved in the publication of the book, especially the team at Bloomsbury. And just a quick introduction of the contents of the book, if I can find my tools. Are there tools? Are there no tools to like show stuff? Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm kind of figuring out how to use PowerPoint proper here. This laser pointer. Okay, so the just a quick introduction. So the introduction of the book, basically, I introduce a Japanese philosophy of education, focusing on the Kyoto school. So I talk about Nishida Kitaro, Kimura Motomori, Watsuji Tetsurō, and Mori Akira. And then chapter one, I look at the whole idea of relational education in Watsuji, focusing on his book on Confucius. Chapter two, I talk about the worries that probably came up in chapter one, a critique of the loss of alterity, of a sense of unique selfhood that can happen because of fixed roles. And then chapter three, I look at Watsuji's reading of Zen Master Dogen and a more personal and critical view of education that he comes up with there, and this person-to-person type of education. Chapter 4, 5, 6, I shift the focus to Mori Akira, and I'm going to be presenting on that later. But chapter 4, basically looking at objective conditions, objective consequences, the learning theory. Chapter 5, I look at developmental psychology and a different take on self-awareness, the philosophy of self-awareness. And then chapter 6, it's really a question of, hey, is this doable? Is this something that people can use? And I give some doable examples in education. Okay, but there are some influences behind this book, which is why I asked Takaya Sensei and Catherine to be with us today. Um, this book does not stand alone. It's part of what I feel is a growing discourse. So Nishida Sensei had the philosophy of no mind, which Catherine was the main translator, and we translated a few years back. And basically, this book brought down the idea of self-awareness to something that people experience in their own private moments of losing themselves in what they do, fully engaging something that they're doing. This idea of mushin or no mind, and this book and Nishida Sensei and all of his teachings were actually a major part of my shift from pure philosophy to engaging clinical pedagogy and Philosophy of Education. So, to represent that work, Catherine, who is the main translator, is here. So, Catherine Sevilla-Liu is a PhD student at the Kyushu University. She was the main translator of this book, and she does research on sociological and narrative approaches to comparative education. She's looking at this whole discourse that looks at Japanese contributions to education. And then another book that was very influential, I actually had to revise my whole book after reading Takaya Shoko's book, the Pedagogic Anthropology of I and Tao, coming from and returning to Nishida philosophy. It's in Japanese, but when I read it, I was in the middle of revising my book, and I just had to really incorporate and the whole my whole trajectory now into doing Nishida research is actually because of Takaya-san. And so the English review is actually out, and Takaya also speaks English. So I think slowly we'll get more and more of these ideas available in English. And so the author of this book is here, and Takaya Shōko, she's a lecturer at Kyoto University at the Graduate School of Education, and she does research on philosophy of education in modern Japan, philosophy, pedagogy, and anthropology of Nishida Kitaro and his successors. And I asked Nishida Sensei to give a little message. I chose this picture because, Nankan, don't you feel, for those of us who know Nishida Sensei, he kind of feels like that, when he kind of laughs to himself. Anyway, this is a message I asked him, and he wrote for us, and I'll say it in English. He said, "Congratulations on the new book. Anton wrote this book, but I think the idea probably came up while he was talking to Catherine. So it is the work of both of them, and that's I'm very happy about that. And congratulations." These two people uh, really focus on the wisdom in Japan and have been trying to communicate that outside Japan. And he expresses his thanks for that. And a lot of these ideas are very difficult to put into words, especially to put into a foreign language. And not only just introducing that, but really creating these new opportunities to discuss these ideas. And he expresses his deep respect for that. And he also says that he's very happy that his young friend Takaya Shoko is here. And Takaya is his Nishira Sensei student. And Nishira Sensei wanted to make it too, but he has various things keeping him busy, so he's not going to be able to join us. He will be seeing the videos though, and so he sends his regards. Part of what brings Takaya Sensei and me and Catherine together is this influence of Nishira Sensei. So I'm very thankful that he's with us, at least in his thoughts and spirits. Okay, so that's it for my part, and I think it's exactly time for Takaya-san's part. Yoshiko onegaishimasu.
Uh, is it
Oh, sorry, sorry,
Takaya
sorry.
Sensei's turn?
Not I'm confusing the order. Yeah, Catherine's part first. My bad.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's just check if. Hmm. Okay, looks good. Can you see the slides? Okay, great. So, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, I'll be talking about Professor Nishihira's book, The Philosophy of No Mind, which was the subject of the book that I, along with Anton, had translated in 2024. Well, actually, a few years before that, before it actually got published. And from that lens, I'd like to look at how we might look at a proposed type of learning called Type 2 learning. So, since many of you may not be familiar with these two terms, I'd like to first introduce what Mushin is, and followed by what type 2 learning is, before diving into looking at type 2 from the lens of Mushin before concluding with some reflections and concluding remarks. So, Why talk about the philosophy of mind in the first place? Of no mind in the first place. So in this forum, I think as Anton had mentioned, all three of us have been greatly influenced by the philosophical work of Professor Nishida Tadashi. So he works in the fields of the educational philosophy of the human person, as well as clinical pedagogy. And when you look at the overview of Nishida Sensei's work, you can see the resonances with our concerns about the human life cycle as a process, replete with tensions, and of themes of human formation, becoming, and care. But more broadly, I think that as educational researchers and practitioners, I believe that the philosophy of Mushin provides a useful and nuanced framework that might also lead us to a deeper consideration regarding pressing issues within education. So this was what I attempt to do in this presentation. So what is Mushin or no mind? Mushin or no mind is a deeply culturally rooted term that's widely used today in everyday Japanese society. So a lot of Japanese people here probably would hear mushi ni piano hiteita, things like that. Basically, to lose oneself or get thoroughly absorbed in doing something. Usually, it's playing the piano or maybe some martial art or even a sport. And often refers to a desirable state of consciousness assumed to yield optimal performance in one's chosen activity. And it often implies a sense of self forgetfulness, a sublimity or a submersion in a particular undertaking, similar to being in the zone or in the flow state. So it refers to a perspective towards understanding the process of creativity or peak performance, and particularly as it relates to cultivating the self. However, the word mushin has taken on and still connotes different meanings depending on the context. So, Professor Nishihira explores how mushin has been used in these varying contexts and how they might relate to one another. So, he looks at, for example, how scholars speaking to English speakers about Zen, such as Titi Suzuki, Izutsu, have constructed it, how no performer Zeyabi has talked about it, or how it's been talked about in martial arts, even in society and politics, and in literature and psychology. So all of these have slightly different nuances depending on the context. And he kind of brings us throughout this book to a general picture of what Mushin might be, how we might picture it. And he gives us this gestalt. Mushin, as an experience, is established through a process of something arising after something has been extinguished. It's important to note that he says that it has different moments, and depending on which moment is highlighted, differing forms of Mushin appear. So it's a very small chart, but if you can see it, you'll see that there are moments of detaching. This is something that we normally associate with mushin, where one feels like where one distance oneself from the way one normally works. So there's a ceasing of calculations. There's the emptying of the self, absolute negation. But we don't do this just to negate. We do this so that one might be open. One can be empty so that enabling something new to arise. So that is here, well, technically here in number four. And that's something new that arises is something that is felt to be from the yonder shore, from the other side. It's felt as if it were a grace. I think the Greeks would call it one's muse in a sense. And hopefully that manifests in the here and now. And how does that feel to the person in himself? Well, the person feels as if there's him, but also there is a connection to the environment. So there is a subjectivity there, but it's not like in the first encounter before this extinguishing or detaching. Izutsu calls it I that is one with the instrument. You feel oneself present there, present, but also together and one with the environment or whatever tool you are using. It's important to say that Nishihira says that we cannot grasp its full picture. Its totality is always a step ahead. So if you see the small graph here, you can see that there are many small words here: shallow, unrefined, and heartlessness. So it's important to note that this diagram does not include the pejorative ways that mushin has also been used. So at one time or another, it's been used to mean a shallow or unrefined or a certain heartlessness. And in Japanese, it's actually also even meant as pestering somebody for money. So, 親戚から金を無心されて困っている is also something that the Japanese people say for the same word. So this implies that mushin actually has an mutually overcoming and continuously reversing logic. Just when you think that you've kind of captured it, it slips away from you because it has two vectors, a negating vector towards nothingness and a vector affirming things as they are. So the easiest way to think about it is to start with everyday ushin. So we're immersed in the usual way we do or think about things, but through whatever practices we might have, we begin to travel the negating vector towards nothingness. We start to question and perhaps even reject what we've accepted as true, or we haven't even really thought about one way or another. But somewhere along the line, at some point, we again reverse course. We again reverse course and then go towards the vector affirming things as they are. We turn towards mushin as ordinary mind or 360-degree mushin. And what's important here is while 360-degree mushin and 0-degree ushin seem to arrive at the same place, 360-degree mushin in reality contains this 180-degree mushin. We actually arrive at the horizon beyond this opposition of having and negating. So as it's written in the book, it's an affirmation on a different dimension, mediated by negation. So, oh, sorry. What might examples be? I know this is a little bit um it sounds very esoteric, so let's see if you can try to think about like some examples where that might be the case in your life. For me, I can probably give you the time when I was doing art in Kyoto Geijutsu Daigaku. I was ready to kind of let go of the things that I previously thought was cool, like when I was uh, probably young and like thinking about like splatter art or something like that. I thought that they were very very juvenile. They're not what you would call artistic. But then and I was ready to learn something new from Japanese painting. But then I find myself 2 years in and doing one of my final projects and actually using those techniques once again, but this time hopefully more skillfully. But then realizing that these are techniques that I used to I think were very juvenile were something that I'm actually using now, of hopefully with more skill. And I think that's something I think we've all experienced maybe in our lives as well. Back in the days, I'm sure we've had our rebellious youth period where we thought that our parents like probably didn't know anything, and we were very rebellious about what they were teaching us. But maybe coming to an age where maybe there was something there to what they said, that maybe there was some truth there that we weren't yet ready to hear. Anyway, I will leave you to think about examples in your own life, but let's go to type 2 learning. So Mushin here sounds very distant from our experience, maybe even very esoteric despite the examples that we're trying to give here. But I argue that entering its logic can help give us a richer and more nuanced perspective on pressing issues within education. And so, to that end, I'd like to take up this case of a form of learning that was proposed by comparative education researchers Jeremy Lapley and Hikaru Komatsu back in 2017 called Type 2 Learning. So, for context, they propose this theory of learning to help explain why many countries, for example, Japan and South Korea, who reported lower levels of student initiative, also had higher PISA science scores, which implies that students can creatively apply what they learn to new contexts. So this invited more reflection regarding our presumptions about teaching and learning, and reminds us that education does not only involve questions about what and how best to teach, but it's also tied to epistemological and ontological concerns. It has additionally been invoked to advance educational practices that are more attuned to cross-cultural differences, to critique persistent assumptions of inferiority of non-Western educational systems, and also to support a decolonial shift within comparative education research. So, in short, they brought out questions that are something that we really wanted to engage in, which is what does it mean to learn or to teach, and who gets included in this conversation. But what is type 2 learning? So, first, to understand that, we have to understand the assumptions it's built on. So, it assumes that we each see the world through an implicit frame, creating the horizon which delineates which we can and cannot understand at that point in time. So, this is the drawing that I had hopefully reproduced from their journal. So, hopefully, this kind of makes sense. You see the horizon being formed here. And inside that horizon are pieces of knowledge that are one, already known, something that we already know, but there are also things that we know we do not know. So those are the known unknowns. But outside that horizon are also the things that we do not know that we don't know. And from these assumptions, the researchers proposed two types of learning. Type 1, learning of facts within the horizon, and type 2, learning of facts beyond the horizon. And to kind of explain this easier, I think this quote helps explain what type 2 learning might be. Type 2 learning is possible when a student faces something that she finds neither understandable nor interesting, and yet brackets his or her existing frame while continuing to struggle long enough until the frame itself changes. So what we get is a picture like this, that type 2 learning, in contrast to type 1 learning, that is more focused on acquiring predetermined information or skills. It prioritizes a change in frame. And to make it possible, there is a certain persistence, obedience, and deference to authority without the student's interest or understanding that's required. And the implications are that the teacher is the authority here and not so much the learner. But that the self is able to change versus type 1, where the self is consistent. So in that article, these are what was emphasized: persistence, obedience, deference to authority, and also teacher as the authority. So, what might type 2 learning be from the lens of Mushin? For me, as it emphasizes not so much acquiring of information or skills, but a change in frame, type 2 resonates with this movement of negation in Mushin, of letting go of one's preconceived notions. So, type 2 makes way for a change in frame through persisting in doing something one does not understand, guided by one's obedience to authority. So it brings to light the importance of cultivating that skill of staying in that place of ambiguity, of difficulty, and even of humility. And I believe it's a necessary initial movement, often highlighted in religion and in many Japanese theories of practice and cultivation. But it might be misunderstood to mean that negation necessarily brings about that state of creativity. But the philosophy of Mushin reminds us that this initial negation is a necessary but insufficient condition. Mushin can only be arrived at as a result of assiduous practice. However, it's not realized simply as an extension of training. Rather, it's when the content of practice is extinguished that Mushin comes to be, Nishihira writes. So, from the perspective of 360-degree ordinary mind, one then also needs at some point to have this negation of negation. So, let's further inquire as to what we might need to, in a sense, negate. So type 2 learning from Mushin. I'd also like to look at obedience without understanding. So Rapi and Komatsu urges us to consider the importance of students' obedience and deference to their teacher, even when students themselves do not understand or are interested in the topic. So they bring out the examples of rote memorization of Confucian texts during the Tokugawa period, where students were not expected to understand but were required to read aloud and memorize without understanding. And this is framed as an exercise in expanding the learner's frame. They even write that learning without understanding the meaning of the content is the only way to bring about a change in the student's frame. Again, it highlights the role of the teacher in the educative relationship, something that has been probably minimized lately these days, and also highlights the de-emphasized values of obedience, trust, and effort, something that I think we also need. But I wonder if this might be misinterpreted as I or you will never need to understand, both by students and by teachers. So Mushin doesn't really talk about the necessity of understanding or not understanding content. But I would like to bring in the idea of no Master Zeami's idea of Mushin as Ishin, as one mind or intent. So he writes, well, Nishida writes that on stage, Mushin means to bind with one mind. Focusing intently on the performance, a single intention connects all the artistic techniques into one stream throughout the song. So for me, Zeami's Mushin or Ishin is premised on two things on the part of the performer at the moment of performing, which one doesn't really see in type 2 learning, which is a clear intent and a sense of agency. Perhaps there's a place for not understanding it, but how might we then bring the sense of agency and ownership that often comes with understanding when it is actually needed? I'd like to go into this further by talking about intent and commitment as well. So in Rapley and Komatsu's article, they also talk about how many teachers in Japan have a transformative aim, that learning for them is about changes to the way of thinking, feeling, and organization of the student. And that perhaps 73% of Japanese teachers also said that the main thing they wanted their students to learn from a lesson was to think about things in a new way. So teachers may have this intent to broaden students' horizon, but I wonder if this gets across to students so that that would engender their own agency for the process. If this intent is not well communicated, might type 2, while aiming at changing the frame, result in something altogether different, such as unrealistic self-expectations on the part of the student or excessive self-criticism. And I also wonder about this peace commitment. Given their findings, Rapti and Komatsu also ask us to consider the possibility that students may still value or remain committed to their classroom work, despite lacking interest in, enjoyment, or understanding of the material. And I guess that is possible, but I always believe that we are always thinking about we have some kind of aim when we're doing something. So, if students do not understand neither the material being learned nor this transformative aim, what then might they be valuing or committing to in the process that makes them stay with this process? A commitment to learning devoid of interest, enjoyment, or understanding might suggest the fixation of another kind of frame, this time in the social dimension. So, might there be value for external approval or defense of one's identity and reputation that we are reinforcing here, even while they are committed ostensibly to the process of, well, type 2 learning of this change in frame? Well, just basically, I guess, the effort required from them. So, type 2 learning here brings to the fore important questions and reminds us that learning necessarily involves questions of how we know and what kind of beings we take ourselves to be. And also reminds us of the necessity of being able to stay in this place of not knowing, the necessity of effort, in a sense. And also reminds us the emphasized values of trust, obedience, and persistence. But brought together with Mushin, one might also say that type 2, interpreted as negation, may not be our final stopping point. This negation again needs to be negated by being brought again towards the type 1 learning. And as we travel along this negating vector, perhaps we need not ignore a student's intent, but find ways to communicate and orient each other towards this aim of education, which perhaps in a sense requires trust on another level. Can you, in a way, trust the students that they would want that for themselves? And we need to develop a better ways of seeing this process of transformation. How do you know that they're valuing or committing to something that we are actually also mutually agreed upon? So as I end this presentation, I'd like to end this with a quote. And this is something that I had actually loved so much that I had, well, did a calligraphy on it, which is engendering the non-abiding mind, or in today's Japanese, Omu Shoju Nishogoshi. This is something that Zen Master Takuan had enjoyed Sword Master Yagyu Munenori to do when practicing his swordsmanship. So the first half of the Japanese, or the last half of the English, seems to emphasize a negation, a non-abiding mind. However, if you think about it more closely, one begins to understand that Takuan is asking for something more ambitious, a more dynamic, flexible mind that's able to meet the other side in order to fully respond to the experience at hand. So sometimes in trying to become mushin, in trying to negate or unlearn something, we kind of stop at the mind trying to remove things. But and then the mind becomes the thing that that exists in our mind. Rather than fixating on negating, on not letting the heart mind arise, can we instead engender or give rise to a non-abiding mind that does not settle at easy answers, but continues to, to think about things and to respond. And as I come to the end of this presentation, I hope we can begin to ask questions like these. How might we engender our own and students' agencies toward a more fundamental educational aim, perhaps of transformation? And how might we better see and watch over this process? And as we learn and educate, how might we productively bring together in tension the various opposing tendencies within education? A student-oriented and a teacher-oriented one, an Eastern or a Western one, a useful or a useless kind of education? Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'd love to, I guess, address them, or if you have any comments, that would also be
Arigato
great.
gozaimashita. Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, so we have around 6 minutes for questions. And of course, if that's not enough, we'll still have 20 minutes at the end for the open discussion. So yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Hopefully you will show up. Catherine, could you unshare? Anyone? If you could just raise your hands and you can speak directly.
Sorry. Hey, and now
Shane-san,
ask.
go ahead. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, Thank you, Catherine. Can you hear me well?
Yes, thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm also very heavily influenced by both philosophers you mentioned, Professor Nishida and Professor Jeremy. Um, I I have a question. So when you mentioned the work of Nishihira Sensei and his work on no mind. You also mentioned that he applied this concept to several different fields, including art, martial art, psychology, and also politics. Um, this this is very interesting to me because when we depict no mind, right? Like when we depict like playing piano with no mind, it's quite easy to picture that, or we can imagine like shooting arrow with no mind. But for example, like like a political participation. Like, can we go to an election with no mind? That sounds a bit concerning. So would you mind elaborating more on like the political and social connotation of the concept of no mind? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really like that question. I like that actually we didn't really just talk about the personal effects of Mushin, but also talk about what that might mean socially and ethically. One of the uses of no mind was actually when we talk about the heaven of no mind. When people, for example, follow, I guess, that when we talk about the habit of mind, we talk about following something that is greater than you. And a lot of times people interpret that as knowing one's place. So that's one interpretation that happened. If you look at Ishida Baigan and let me let me check what that I guess way of thinking was. But basically, some people interpret that to mean that you should just know one's place and to be able to stay there and to be able to support the existing order. But one other interpretation of that would be to be able to really listen to see what this social situation might need, even though it's not already there. So that is, in a sense, being able to be in the heaven of no mind. And that could actually also support social change when you realize that this is something that this society would need and be able to have the conviction to push for that. So it is actually a contentious point in the sense of, okay, so which one are is that is what we should do? I think it's always a question of the way that no mind can be interpreted is always very ambiguous, and I think that is the point of where we need to decide, okay, how am I going to interpret this, and what do we feel is the right way to do this? Yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much, Shiyu-san. Anyone else? I think we have time for a quick comment, perhaps. Yeah, Ed, go for it.
Yeah, hi. I wasn't sure if I should butt in or not because yeah, I have other opportunities to express my opinions. But that was a great presentation. Yeah, I've read the article that it's based on, or the draft. It's very, very interesting. And I think it came across very clearly the way you presented it. At one point on one of the slides, you mentioned religion. You said the initial movement of negation is often highlighted in religion. And I wondered if you had any particular religion in mind, because, or maybe no mind, because I can't remember if this was in connection with the work of Rapley and Komatsu, but it strikes me that often what they do is basically to kind of posit a binary, or a sort of west-east binary, where, the west is material and the east is spiritual, um, broadly speaking. But and I mean, some of the perhaps uh, people listening from the Philippines might have an opinion on this as well. But it strikes me, having been brought up a Catholic, that I think Rappling Komatsu and others like them often ignore the spiritual traditions that are there in Western or Christian culture, and don't consider whether, for example, when you talk about movements of negation, or basically the idea that you sort of let go of your rational considering self and leave yourself open to, you know, inspiration or other ways of thinking. that reminds me of, a lot of the stories of Catholic saints, leaving themselves open to the sort of visitations of the Holy Spirit. Um, that there's on the spiritual side of things, isn't there perhaps more overlap or similarity between some of these different religious traditions, East and West, than many scholars allow for? Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense, or if you have any response to that.
Thanks so much,
Yeah,
Catherine. With that, we're a
yeah.
bit tight. If you could give a quick response now, but let's hold on to this question because I'm sure we could pick it up again when
Okay.
we get to the end.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And yes, I do see your point. A lot of times I feel like um, Asia or Japan gets positioned a lot of times with this emotional, spiritual aspect. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I think no mind or negation, there is also a movement of negation, as you mentioned, in Catholicism when we talk about metanoia or a change of heart that in a sense is also already a negation. And Nishihira Sensei also talks about that in his book as well, about a no mind, where there is a Zen interpretation, a Pure Land interpretation, but also a Christian interpretation. So there is a sense no mind is not necessarily just a Japanese phenomenon. It's something that is actually broadly in the culture, but he is talking about it mainly from a Japanese lens. So it doesn't necessarily have to be one, even though many people think that is just Japanese. Okay, I hope that helps.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, and we'll definitely go back to that. I think that connects to perhaps all three of our talks. Yeah, thank you so much. So thank you, everyone. And if you have some more questions, please hold on to it because we do have the final discussion at the end. And we'll go straight to the next talk from Takaya Sensei. Takaya Sensei, yoroshiku onegai shimasu.
I will share my screen. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about Nishida's education for awakening. And Catherine San's presentation is more focused on theoretical level of the concept of Musin, and my presentation will be more historical stories about the education for awakening. So first, I will discuss why education for awakening matters for you, and then I will introduce the interaction between Nishida and Kimura as a concrete example of education for awakening. So I guess some of you in the audience may be researchers of Japanese philosophy, and others study philosophy of education or more broadly educational policy and practice in Japan. So my question will be twofold. So why is education important for Japanese philosophers? And why is awakening matters to the philosophy of education? So the answer lies in the intersection of the two fields. So I call this area as Japanese philosophy of education, or maybe we can call it Japanese philosophies of education in plural. And this is exactly the title of Anton Sensei's book. So why education matters to Japanese philosophy first? And there is a wide range of Japanese philosophy from the pre-modern to the contemporary period. I will focus on the Kyoto school here. And this is a unique group of the 20th century philosophers in Japan, led by Nishida Kitaro and Tanabe Hajime, and followed by figures like Nishitani or Ueda. And they are famous for seeking to combine Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism, with Western philosophy. But I'd like to say there are also some genealogies from the Kyoto School of Education. So Kimura and Kōsaka studied directly under Nishida and Tanabe, and they're in the 1 year later than Nishitani. And Mori is younger, and he was a disciple of Tanabe. So although they define themselves in different names like philosophy of education or philosophical anthropology of education or clinical pedagogy, I believe we can call them the Kyoto School of Education as a whole. So today I will discuss Kimura, and Anton sensei will talk more about Mori. And in Japan, the thinkers of the Kyoto School of Education were almost forgotten after the World War II because they are associated with wartime nationalist engagement. But in the last 15 years, there has been a major rediscovery of their works through a postmodern lens. So there are the studies of Kimura or Mori or Kosaka, Katsuta, and this book of Kawakami-san has just been published this month, and it discusses post-war development of education and politics in the Tanabe's genealogy. So there want more researches in these works. And in English, this book, Education at the Kyoto School of Philosophy, was published in 2012. And there are some chapters contributed to these books. And now here, Anton sensei's book, it has been published. So they are also broadcasted to global space. And we move on to the second question. So why awakening matters to education? So Anton sensei describes my book. So he introduced my book in the introduction of this session. And he says that my book develops how awakening unfolds in education. And it explores Nishida's ideas and also the letters between Nishida and his disciple Kimura Motomori, and showing how the process of education for awakening actually happens. So to the question of why awakening matters to education, I'd like to say awakening bridges a gap between ideas and practice. So I will go in details. So what is awakening? So there are some answers to this question. For Nishida, awakening was a fundamental fact. So self-awakening is a self-evident fact to Nishida. So just as Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, cogito, Nishida built his philosophy on the fact of self-awakening, the identity of the reflecting and the reflected selves. But on the other hand, Nishida also suggested that awakening has levels, some levels. So it starts at an intellectual, superficial level and moves to an emotional or volitional level, and finally reaches to the deepest level. So the awakening of absolute nothingness is the deepest level. So Nishida has two different ideas on self-awakening. So one is a self-evident fact, and the other is so awakening has some levels from the superficial to the deepest levels. And Tanabe or Mori challenged Nishida. So Tanabe challenged Nishida asking, can philosophy really systematize this kind of religious self-awakening? So Nishida's deepest self-awakening sounds very odd to Tanabe. So Tanabe couldn't understand Nishida's religious ideas. So Tanabe feared Nishida was moving away from philosophy and falling into religious dogmatism. Or Mori, Tanabe's disciple, also raised question. He argues that the series of self-awakening, like Nishida, have paid little attention or just neglected the process by which individual human beings become self-awakened. So Mori pointed out that human beings are not born awakened, they become awakened through human becoming. So Anton sensei will talk about more on Mori. These thinkers disagreed on the details of awakening, but they all agreed that awakening matters in philosophy or in education. So why? is awakening longed for. So in my view, awakening functioned as an object of dream among the Kyoto school. So Nishida's idea of the deepest awakening of absolute nothingness functioned as an object of dream, that if they continue philosophical inquiries like Nishida, so one might someday attain the same awakening of absolute nothingness as Nishida. But it's impossible to reach awakening in this way, because one can attain self-attaining only when awakened by and to oneself. So not by and to Nishida, but oneself. So it cannot be, awakening cannot be attained by, so to speak, stealing one's teacher's self-awakening. So having unintentionally allowed his students to dream, Nishida must consider how to shatter that dream. So this is why Nishida needed pedagogical tact. The first level, Nishida modified his ideas on awakening. So Nishida argued that awakening occurs in I and you relationship, consisting of conversing with and responding to one another. And the individual self is awakened solely by another individual self, in mutual responding. And the world of facts originates from when and where I and you immediately face each other and speak to each other. So Nishida believes that the world of facts itself is grounded in this I and you interpersonal relationship. So this is an ideal level of Nishida's awakening. And on the level of practice, I will focus on the real-life relationship between Nishida and his disciple Kimura. So Kimura studied Anton Nishida at Kyoto University in 1920s and moved to Hiroshima University in 1929 to teach philosophy and aesthetic there. And despite the distance, they exchanged letters, and I cite Nishida's letter to Kimura. So in his letter, Nishida says, I believe that's the problem you asked about the other day. So Kimura asked something to Nishida the other day. And that problem can only be solved from my standpoint of self-determination with eternal. So this is Nishida's philosophical concept. So I'm not sure if it will be a while before I get into the issue of free will. So Kimura asked Nishida the issue of free will someday, and Nishida writes it should be solved from Nishida's standpoint of self-determination of eternal now. So the problem of the problem of free will is because Marxism gained popularity among students at the time, and Kimura fears that it can fall into material determinism that negates human free will. And Tanabe also started to study Hegel, and Hegel also can risk ideal determinism. So Kimura wanted to defend human free will against the threat of determinism. And Kimura got Nishida's letter, and Kimura also wrote this in his diary. Nishida-sensei said, the present determines the present itself. So to me, going that far, like Nishida, and combining meditation and peace of mind seems like a very distant dream. But at the same time, it also seems to be just around the corner. So Kimura doesn't write the word dream exactly, but Google Translate suggests me that I should put this word here. So I'm happy to have a dream here. So we can say Kimura is a dreamer that dreams for awakening, just as Nishida does. So to find the answer for the foundation of free will, Kimura focused on artistic creation. So he imagined a sculptor striking a chisel against an unfinished statue. So Kimura believed that the artist is truly free in the moment of creation. So Kimura writes, a single stroke of the chisel was nothing other than the act of leaping over the bottomless valley in the expressive activity. So the leaping is really foundationless, but that's why the sculptor is really free. So here, Kimura uses the word leaping to describe this experience. And when Nishida heard Kimura's ideas, he wrote letters to Kimura and encouraged Kimura to write more. The idea of a single stroke of the chisel sounds interesting, so philosophers must be aware of such a point. And Nishida later also writes, so I have submitted a short essay to the journal, and I'm also thinking of a unification in leaping. So Nishida also uses the word leaping here. So Nishida responds to Kimura. So the context are different in Kimura and Nishida. And in the following year, both published papers on free will. So Nishida's view remained rather consistent. So he argues that we are limited by history, but we are free because we are determination of the eternal. So this is Nishida's phrase. And in contrast, Kimura's view was more practical or in more concrete context. So Kimura argues that we are limited by physical matter, but human will can realize various demands through that matter by freely setting goals on it. So the sculptors can choose wood or stone to make a statue, to freely set goals to their artistic activities. So they worked on the same topic of free will, but the argument develops in different directions. And after finishing this paper, Kimura felt some sense of relief that I have fought metaphysical materialism, Marxism, and Hegel's words fun. So in short, I have fought a fierce battle for free will, and I am gradually coming down. So Kimura was had some sense of satisfaction, but the very next year he came across an unexpected turn in his life. So he was called back to Kyoto University to the chair of education, and not to teach philosophy or aesthetics. Kimura wanted to remain in philosophy and aesthetics, but he had to teach pedagogy now, and pedagogy has taken hold of a mass of melancholy in my heart. So Kimura says in his diary. So it became a hard time for Kimura. And in the same year, Nishida wrote a short essay about education. And also Nishida never mentioned Kimura in it. Many scholars believe that Nishida wrote this essay especially for Kimura as a way of guiding him through his new path of education. So in his essay, Nishida writes, educational belief can be taught of a kind of formative process. The educator forms the human being as a sculptor forms a sculpture. So it's very like Kimura's writing. So to sum up, I interpret the exchanges between Nishida and Kimura as responses between I and you. So Nishida's responses to Kimura is a concrete example of interpersonal responses. And Nishida and Kimura are awakened to themselves in their responses. And maybe Kimura wanted to make more in his experience of awakening, but actually they are both began to become awakened. So in that case, what I or Nishida can do is to make a response through which self-awakening begins in you, Kimura, and to become the absolute other too. So this is Nishida's words and my interpretation. And in the book of Anton Sensei, he argues that his book and my book are like siblings from Nishida Sensei's book. And he contrasts them like Bodhidharma. Anton Sensei took the side of doing in the education for awakening. So hoping that people would raise against the status quo and awaken their efforts. And like Matsu, my book took the side of being in education for awakening, praying that people would let go of the poisoned excesses of effort. So my question is, what's the difference of the doing side and the being side in the education for awakening, and how can we combine them or use them in different timing? So this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Takaya-san. Your last question, I think that would be great for the very end when we all do our open discussion. So let's save that. Let's hold on to that. But let's have questions for Takaya-san first from the audience. Anyone? Just feel free to raise your hand. Yes, Kazushi-sensei, dozo.
Yeah, thank you very much, Takaya-san, and thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Also, a wonderful one by Catherine too. And I really appreciating your presentations. And for one reason, I happen to be working on quite a similar topic to write an article. And so this is my question and to the Takaya-san. And regarding the relationship between Nishida and, for example, Kimura, Motomori, and I guess you needed to, skip over because of the time constraint. But I think the very interesting common sort of starting point was German philosopher Fichte's philosophy, right? So, and my question is, when we use the English expression of self-awakening, from the start, the term has a very religious and educative, I think, connotations. But in the case of the Fichte, and also in even Nishida, 自覚における直感と発生, I think it was translated as simply as self-consciousness or being aware of one's sort of thinking. So I think I do understand that because today's overall topic was on education, I think so you are trying to draw out a very interesting, important sort of possibilities. But I think the ground or foundation, starting point was a simple fact of the ordinary experience of even now, I think, we are talking, but we are being conscious and aware of it. So I think I wanted to bring it up, this sort of a initial starting point, especially that comes out Kimura's translation work of Fichte. And also another point is this it could be directed to Catherine too, but I think, for example, when we think of Mushin, and already we are in a very good direction actually. But I think at the start in Buddhism, especially, there is also the notion of mumyo, lack of light, and that's the really tormenting, I think, agony as a starting point for our search for Mushin and the enlightenment or self-awakening. So I thought in that two sense, I think it may be better to just briefly confirm the starting point that lies at the bottom of these talk about one very important talk about Mushin and self-awakening. Yeah, I'm not sure this is a good question to Takaya-san, but just that is what I had in mind.
Thank
Yes.
you so much, Kadashi
Yeah.
Sensei.
Yeah.
Go for it,
So
Takaya.
that's a very important point that I missed.
Yeah.
It's certainly that Kimura, the very translator of 50s, the business software,
Yeah.
and the concept of jikaku
Yeah.
is also self-consciousness in 50s philosophy. And I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
But today I wanted to use the concept of awakening to have a double meanings.
Yeah.
So this is a really common experience to every moment of everyone.
Yeah.
But Nishida also argues that awakening has a deeper level, and the deepest level is the really awakening of absolute nothingness. And
Yeah.
to Nishida, the experience of awakening, even the deepest awakening is fact that has self-evidence,
Yeah.
but that's not so evident to everyone around him. So this is a case that Nishida had to teach his philosophy of awakening.
Yeah.
So this is a condition for education for awakening. So I took up that specific point of the education, awakening matters in education.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very
So
much.
I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
For the second point on mumyo and ignorance or non-enlightenment, starting from mumyo versus starting from ushin or having mind. I think that's an important point. I think we should definitely pick that up for the last 20 minutes though, yeah. But do you have any initial thoughts you want to share about that, Takaya-san? Is there a strong sense of mumyo or this deep suffering in the discussion between well, I think it was there, yeah, between Nishida and Kimura?
So maybe Kimura believes that he is in the state of mumyo, but for Nishida, it's not. He's not. He is always self-aware, self-awakened, because self-awakening is a fact to everyone. So the teaching of self-awakening is not a teaching of knowledge that is outside of oneself, but I don't know how to say, erase your misbelief of not knowing. So I'd like to say so.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Takaya-san. Thank you. Okay, so it's time for the last for my part. So again, we'll talk. And again, if you have questions, and for example, Kadashi Sensei's question now, and then Takaya Sensei's question at the end of her talk, I think that's something that we can start with for the overall discussion at the end. So please hold on to those. Please hold on to those. Okay, so let me share my slides again. Okay, so can everyone see my screen? Is it all good? All right, so abstract, applied, and reconstructive philosophy, the method of Japanese philosophies of education. Let me. Okay, so just to start with, and just something I wanted to share. To be honest, I'm very nervous about this book. And I've mentioned this to several of my colleagues, and the reason why is because I'm trying a lot of things in this book for the first time. So when I went to France last year for my sabbatical, initially I was just going to put together my existing articles that I'd already published about Mori and Watsuji. But then, I was thinking about my career, and I realized that the way I write, even my previous book on Watsuji, did not reflect my personal values about philosophy. It's very abstract, it's very hard to read, it's very technical. I spend all my time, Watsuji said this, Mori said this. Uh, but that's important. I think that's important, but that's not when I feel truest to philosophy. That's not when I feel like that's really what I value. And when do I feel that? I feel that actually when I teach. I really love teaching. And my best ideas come to me when I teach. And so I wanted to write a book as myself. And for me in philosophy, that means writing as Anton Sensei, not just as a doctor, as a PhD. And so I ended up rewriting the whole book. Everything's new. I changed the whole methodology of the book, which hence the title of this talk. And I'm trying to address two questions at once, maybe a bad idea. The methodological question is, what changes when we actively use examples when doing philosophy? So whether we're teaching or we're just thinking about it ourselves, reading something, writing something. But behind that is a theoretical question, which thankfully Takaya-san set up very well. What is self-awareness? Jikaku. She translates awakening. I also use awakening sometimes. What is jikaku in Japanese philosophy? So, abstract philosophy. This is something that I've really been thinking about the past few days. Sorry, did I just freeze? No, I'm good. Okay, most high-level journal articles, presentations, lectures use little or no examples. When it comes to journal articles, I am definitely guilty of that too. And I generally find this, to be honest, boring. Um, you just hear all of these complex ideas and I can't connect it to anything, and I don't really like that. But I heard recently that actually for some universities, this is on purpose. This is a matter of virtue. And so in some universities, the view is that it's the teacher's job to give high-level abstract ideas, and it's the student's job to connect that to experience. And so if the teacher gives examples, it's kind of taking away the independence of the student to think for themselves. And I had sensed this, I heard it recently, but I had sensed this before, and I've actually I've taught in certain places, and I'm very easy to understand when I teach. And in this place, when I taught, they kind of got annoyed. You could kind of see them like, why are you spoon feeding us, and I've had a student tell me that he doesn't like the way I teach because it makes philosophy seem trite and stupid. And I've been warned too by colleagues like, Anton, you're dumbing it down. Don't dumb it down. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing. I think it can work if students actively come up with examples on their own. So, it still becomes real, but the student does that job, and that's fine if they can confirm their experiential understanding. So, not a criticism. But at the same time, there's a danger. There's a danger. So I'm talking here, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on Mori Akira for this talk. As Takaya Sensei explained, he's a student of Tanabe Hajime, who was the colleague of and co-founder of the Kyoto School. Yeah. And so this from my book, Mori Akira suggests that while it makes perfect sense for idealism to be abstract, something like Hegel, it is after all about arranging ideas in a way that's internally coherent. It's bizarre to have a philosophy of the non-duality of subject and object that does not connect to our lived experience. Not bizarre, it's a performative contradiction, you know. So when you have something like the non-duality of subject and object, you can't turn it into just an idea because that's just the subject part. What about the object part, right? So that's not non-dualism anymore. In the same way, pragmatism is about the unity of thinking and action. And if all you have is an idea of pragmatism and you don't have the experience, well, where's the action part of pragmatism, you know? So I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen, where if the teachers don't do it and the journals don't do it, sometimes students don't bother connecting it to their experience at all. And the idea becomes dead on arrival, you know? And so Mori strongly criticized this. He went beyond idealism by connecting Kyoto School's philosophy of awakening of Jikaku to Dewey's pragmatism. And then he even goes further to connect it to the educational sciences. And Yano Sensei says this is actually one of his biggest contributions. And this was not just a matter of ideas. He actually co-founded Osaka University's School of Human Sciences, which actually has a similar pattern, interdisciplinary study, that similar pattern to the place where I'm at now, School of Interdisciplinary Science and Innovation. Yeah. Anyway, interesting point. Mori and Dewey both point out that the separation of thinking and doing, or making things into just pure ideas without application, actually reinforces the political separation between those who think and those who only do but are not allowed to think. And so in education, Tanaka Tsunemi, who's a Mori Akira scholar, he said that the main approach for teaching philosophy of education, I think even now, is where you have enlightenment from above, keimo, where the philosopher or the theorist or the ideologue from Monbuka Gakusho would just expound abstract ideas, and practitioners, just scramble to figure out how to adjust their practices to those ideas. That actually happened recently, maybe even with things like active learning, which basically came down from heaven and everyone had to do it. And Mori deliberately resisted this approach, trying to communicate with practitioners in ways they could understand. He'd use concrete examples. He'd talk about the experience of teachers. He'd talk about the experience of students. He'd use actual writings by students. He'd talk to parents and he'd write about that. And his goal was to ensure that practitioners understood him, could decide for themselves which ideas resonated with their experience, and could cooperate with him to co-construct ideas. Basically, he didn't want to be abstract because being abstract would be remarkably undemocratic. It disempowers people. And so, that was Mori's writing style, and that deeply influenced the methodology of my book. So what happened was I didn't only use examples, but I actually built each chapter around a case of a particular challenge I had, like a student who was overly competitive or a student who was struggling with losing her sense of herself and things like that. So it really deeply shaped how I do this work. But what does that mean and why is that important? And for a bit of a worked example, let's look at the idea of philosophy. Yeah. So etymologically, philosophia to, the love of and pursuit of wisdom, Sophia. And in the Kyoto school, Sophia wisdom is often seen via the idea of jikaku, awakening self-awareness. And sometimes it's connected to enlightenment experiences, religious awakening, metanoia. And so, if you start with an abstract idea, philosophically, one of the most important ideas of Mori is that Jikaku is part of this process of human becoming, Ningen Seisei, which Takaya Sensei mentioned. He says we exist as a discontinuous continuity between three parts of the personality. That's here in the picture: organic layer, conscious layer, and self-aware layer. And, on surface value, this makes very little sense. But what he does is he connects this to experience via Erikson's developmental psychology. So very important is not only is Erikson a theorist, Erikson is a child psychologist. He actually worked with kids, not just in Western societies. He even worked with indigenous children and think he did autobiographic research, but basically, experience. For example, he'll talk about the organic layer, and he'll give the example of a child trying to climb the stairs by themselves, even though they don't walk steady and they're trying to climb the stairs, and the parents are getting kind of nervous. You don't know if the kid's gonna fall, and sometimes you want to just pick up the kid and can I just carry you? But warning parents that if you keep doing things for the kids, they never get this sense of agency. They never get this sense of autonomy, of being able to do things for themselves. And so that's the organic layer, where we struggle to do things in a physical world with our physical body. And then the conscious layer is this more cerebral layer, and where you learn to use symbols and you learn to use thoughts. And he gives the example here of a student struggling with math. So it's not, comparing himself to his classmates, seeing how he's not doing as well, feeling like a loser. He even talks about mental health and suicide. But basically, suddenly a very different world of, in a sense, living in this world of symbols and comparisons and abstract definitions of what people should be. Now, what happens when he does that example? It's not, so this is the cool thing about Mori. He's not just saying, okay, let's use examples. He explains why. So he has this whole theory of learning. I coded it on the right, but I won't read that. I'll just read this annoying picture I made. And so he says, so he starts with the pragmatic view of learning of John Dewey. And he says, if we're really going to learn, it has to start by observing a real problem. You have to know that it matters. You have to connect with it in your life. And that's a very objective, it's not just subjective, it's objective. It has to do with your encounter with the world that's beyond your ideas. But then you don't just stay in that feeling, but you start to think about it. In step 2, you clarify what the problem is. That means using symbols. You plan what you're going to do about it. Again, that means using symbols. And so you respond intelligently. So you empty the objective pole to make meaning and go beyond brute facts. But then you empty the subjective pole again, by this time doing. So you don't just plan, you actually try things. You do things. And again, you're back to using your hands. You're back to using your senses. And not only are you using your hands, but you're also looking at what is the effect. So I try something and how does it work? And so that's checking consequences. And this whole process of 2 to 4, this is obviously the experimental process in experiential learning, right? So that's pragmatic learning. Very important that even pragmatists miss it, is the 5th stage. You can't just stop with doing things and solving things physically, but you have to generate conclusions that can connect to other contexts. And so this is what they call grounded theory. And so building grounded theories. Yeah. So this is the first 5 stages come from pragmatism, but 6 and 7 actually come from idealism and from the Kyoto school. And so he says, not only do we build grounded theories, but depending on how we act in the world, we start to form certain patterns of living our lives, patterns of how we dwell, basically personal values. And so it's not just I just solve this problem, I solve that problem, but you start to see what are the values that make my life rich and meaningful. And these values are very important, but at the same time, it's not just personal values, but we live in a world where people have values too. And so I might value acceptance and compassion, but other people might value excellence. And how do I square those off with each other? So that's the world of stage 6, yeah? And then stage 7, self-awareness, is basically when, on one hand, it starts to form who you see yourself as. I'm not just Anton. I'm Anton who values wisdom, who values philosophy being done in a real way. These are my values. This make me who I am. This create coherence in my life. But it's not only the identity, but who is the I who is asking, who am I? So the part of actively constructing, questioning, deconstructing old identities to make new ones, that's all part of stage 7. So this is how he sees learning as happening. And so what happens when he talks about organic layer, conscious layer, what he's doing is he's bringing down something that's all the way up here in the world of ideals, 6. And then by giving an example, he brings it down to number 1. And he says, let's see where this is happening in your life. Now I think it's a wonderful thing. to make it real. And I think anyone here who's from that Ateneo where I taught for 5 years, this is how we teach, right? I mean, this is how we were taught to teach, make it real. But so I was so shocked when I came to Japan and people were like, too many examples, Anton. But what I found, and I thank my students, especially Yuri and Ayato, for this, but they told me, there's a danger when you ground theory in experience. Because instead of learning things deeply, students might just reduce the idea to their existing experience. So, for example, I already thought about the organic layer and the conscious layer. The third layer is the self-aware layer. He connects this to Erickson's identity development. And so your body starts to change, and then students start to think about their own identity. This usually happens in middle school, high school, college, and then they start rebelling against their parents. They rebel against authorities. When you come up with an example like this, on one hand, it connects to student experience, but on the other hand, students superficially think they get it. They're like, okay, it's chunibyo. Okay, it's adolescent rebellion. I get it, I get it. But do they really get it? And one of the things I found is that a lot of my students don't realize that there's nothing generic about, chunibyo. It's not like, oh, we're all rebellious teens. But what makes identity formation special is that the identity formation is you, the singular you. And a lot of the students, when I do narrative exercises with them, have barely even come to grips with the fact that they are a unique self, other than all the random roles and expectations that have been foisted on them. And so, in a sense, just because you gave them an example, they can miss the point. They can miss the point. And actually, this does tend to happen with my book, some of the students who read it just took the parts that, kind of already make sense to them and mirror what they already thought. And it was interesting, some other students complained when my examples didn't fit their experience perfectly. And I was like, so it's not supposed to fit your experience perfectly. You're supposed to stretch, but they weren't trying to do that. They weren't trying to do that. And this connects to what Catherine was saying, I think, the whole idea of type 1 learning. But when you have this early simplistic form of pragmatism with no sense of theory, with no sense of idealism or self-awareness, then all you have is just solving problems within your existing horizon, and you never encounter a horizon beyond it. The examples make it stupid, make it trite, instead of opening you to a new world. And so one way is to not give examples. But I think there's another way. And so what I say here is, can we use examples not in their reproductive function, but in their reconstructive function? だから再生産的な具体例ではなくて、再構築的な具体例として。And so, when we look at this graph, what we see here, it's not just one. You don't just observe a real problem and then, okay, I get it. I get what adolescent rebellion is. But you go back to making sense of it, and then you try different things. You're not just going to existing experience, but you're trying different configurations of experience. So there has to be a process of change of experience, of experimentation. And then also, it's not just about connecting it to pre-existing ideals and identities, but the whole part of a self-awareness is this ability you have to question what you currently value, to question how you pull together the various aspects of your life. So what we start to see here, is that when, like, going back to the example of the three stages, you have the organic, conscious, self-aware layer. Usually these are separated as different visions of man as a desirous animal, a utilitarian animal, or as Homo sapiens, as a rational man, or as an existential, spiritual being. But Mori's point is that the challenge of life is that we live all of these at the same time. We are animals and rational and spiritual all at the same time, and that's hard to live with. How do you live with the tension of that? And so something that seems so abstract, like a word like discontinuous continuity, suddenly becomes very poignant. It becomes very painful. You know what that feels like. And what's happening here is, I think, a little bit different from just applied philosophy. Examples hook the idea to experience so you can remember what it's like to be in these different stages. But rather than hooks reducing the idea to experience, they can tug at your experience to make you see your experience differently. There's a prayer that goes, "Disturb us, O Lord." But learning things that disturb your paradigm, that disturb your common sense. And so you might, for example, listening to the previous examples about Erickson's stages of development, you might remember the difficulty of the transitions. What's it like when you're a kid, you're about to enter grade 1, you just learned how to be a spontaneous agent and do things for yourself, and then suddenly you have to enter this world of impersonal roles. It's like, hell, I just learned how to do this stuff. And then you're telling me to put the brakes on it. But in the same way, if you imagine like a high school kid who's finally learned to take pride in being a good student, and then suddenly comes to college and people ask, what's your identity? Where are you trying to place yourself? What's your career? Where do you see your life going? It's like, hey, you just told me to follow the rules. And then suddenly now I have to do something more than that. And so you can start to, it's not just bringing it home to experience, but it starts showing you shadows in your experience, corners that you don't shine light on, and you start to feel how uncertain development is. Not really as steady progress, but as a series of crises, as a tension. And this is none other than what Catherine mentioned. She said negation, right? But this is the movement of negation in the philosophy of nothingness. And so what happens here is the ideas change the way you see your experience. But in the same way, the experience revivifies your ideas, So, for example, self-awareness no longer becomes just like, oh, one religious aha that you get, but it becomes our full engagement with our becoming human, with all those tensions. Okay, so just one last point. I think I hope this is my last slide. Yeah. Is it? Oh, mostly my last slide. Okay, so basically these 2 points come together. So what is philosophy? What is self-awareness? If you have an abstract method of teaching or of doing philosophy, then you tend to have an abstract sense of wisdom. Jikaku becomes a mystical ideal, something impossible to achieve, something that Nishida had it, but I won't. If you do a simplistic application, then you reduce Sophia to doxa, which is a great tragedy. Basically, like Dewey's growth or experience, everyone thinks they know what it means, but no one really does. Same thing, Mori's ideas seem trite because he makes it so accessible. But what we have here is a possibility of third reconstructive examples reveal Sophia within the disturbance of doxa, the disturbance of common sense. Mori, when he was talking about moments of facing crisis and decision, he said, in the moment of this decision, one experiences a phenomenon that can only be described as the collision of the relative and the absolute, where eternity appears in time. And the very idea, it's not something, and self-awareness is not restricted to Zen masters or to people going through deep metanoia, but every person struggling with crisis is, in a sense, standing in the eternal now, as Nishida likes to say. So the method of Mori is not just a style, but if jikaku, if wisdom in Sophia is something that underlies the world of action, this is the only way to do philosophy, is Mori's point. Okay, so I won't read this out, but basically, these just an overview of my points, and I'll open to questions. I went over, so we only have 6 minutes for my questions. I'm so sorry, but thank you very much. So just like last time, anyone feel free to chime in. Cheers, Carson. Nice seeing you. Thanks for coming. Yes, June.
Hi, Anton Sensei. Thank you for your presentation. It's well very fascinating. And I'm currently doing probably a kind of similar doctoral thesis like you're doing. Like I'm trying to design and teach a course based on the Nijuno Ken double eyes mode.
Mm-hmm.
And while I'm designing my research, I just found it is not so easy to like measure the outcome of the class. Like you mentioned Chikaku, and in my research, I also need to measure like for example, the outcome of the unlearning pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
Like what student will achieve at the end of class. But the unlearning process does not have a clear aim, right? Does not have a clear final point. So, I mean, if you want to successfully write a peer-reviewed research, then you have to follow the rule. And how to deal with the tension of the publishing rule and the fact of I mean the fact of the research we are doing is not easy to measure.
Mm-hmm. I'm
Like how do
very
you measure
happy.
Shikaku? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very happy you asked this question. But I'm also scared to answer. Because I know that this will make a lot of people uncomfortable. So part of the influence of my work with Mori, Mori is j- both Kyoto School and pragmatist. And pragmatism is very closely related to science, not the kind of science that reduces people to averages or to populations, but the kind of science that objectively looks at how people act within a context and tracks changes. So it's actually very closely related to operant behaviorism of B.F. Skinner, and it's very closely related to contextual behavioral science, which I mention in my book. But basically, my point is, you actually can measure jikaku. And in my opinion, it's actually not so hard. Um, so for example, ac- every time I do an exam, I will always ask people both an objective component and an example component. So for example, I'll say, explain this idea of like explain Mead's idea of self, and connect it to a particular challenge that you're having in your life. And what happens when they do that is one is I'll be able to see their recall of facts, but I'll also be able to see are those facts. So if you go back to the practical pragmatic spiral thing I did, I will also be able to see if they're able to connect it to their experience. But I will also be able to see shifts in the way that they are talking about their experience. So if it's too clean, then I know that they're not really learning anything new. One of the biggest things I look for is inconsistencies. And so, for example, I have a student who I did research on the stories of students, and you have a student who would talk about herself as somebody who was primarily concerned with grades. But then you start to see where she starts doing certain actions that have nothing to do with her performance or are actually at odds with that particular way of seeing herself. So my point is, you can see changes. You can see how they connect it to an experience, you can see how they connect it to a sense of self, but you can see changes. Now, if you see changes in the sense of self, even though you cannot view the existential I directly, the only way the me changes is if the I change, if the I is able to exert its effect. Sorry, I'm using me words. The only way identity changes is if the existential self is able to put it to question. So even though it's not possible to see the existential self, you can see the effects of the existential self. So if you're interested in that, Catherine's also doing this kind of work, but basically we do a kind of narrative analysis that allows us to see how things connect to experience, how things connect to self. And yeah, it can be done. So But as I said, and I think I'll end with this point, I accept that a lot of people don't like that I am friendly with science. A lot of people would prefer that I just say science and measurement is evil and it's dehumanizing. But in my experience, and this is a point that I argue for in the book, if you really want to help people, you have to see if what you're doing is actually helping. And if you have no way of tracking the effects of what you do on people, then it's actually a bit irresponsible. So on the one hand, I'm very postmodern with a lot of things, but I do believe in learning from consequences. So that means I track my results. That means I measure. Which freaks out people, but I have reasons. So does that make sense, June?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, but I could send you the paper if you want. We're definitely doing work on this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so it's I think time for the main discussion. So yeah, Kiara has her hand up, but now it's free for all. So if you want to ask me, you want to ask Catherine, you ask Takaya, or if you know you ask one and the other one chimes in, it's free for all. So Kiara, yes, please.
Yes, thank you, Anton and everyone. I think that maybe my question starts like it's a question for you, but actually it also refers to things I've heard before. So that's great. The question about I really liked your reference to examples and how that can be beautiful and needed, but also problematic. And I think also in my brain, like it connected to Takaya Sensei point about the self, the you and I, like teacher and students as you and like how they can co-create in a way each other. And I think so. My question is about maybe the multiplicity of students and the possibility of interaction among students. So for me, that is like a decisive point. So to apply to what I've heard from you, if let's say there is an abstract theory. It starts with an abstract theory, and actually that is also, I guess, what Catherine was saying. Like it needs to be maybe a counterintuitive. That's my word, but like a counterintuitive theory in which we have to rethink ourselves in a way that. Well, you need a little bit to trust the teacher that it's not completely nuts, but it is like something that will help us in in the end. But like I don't know, some Advaita Vedanta idea that we are all one, or like something like this. So something is like, oh, what? No, I never thought like this. And then maybe the teacher can give an example that kind of makes sense. And then, okay, that is, I think, really needed. But I really see your point and appreciate that it could make some people say, oh, okay, that thing, okay, that, okay, then in that sense, it's not counterintuitive anymore. It's okay. But what if we then open the floor to other students and then they will give different kind of examples? And then I am sure that maybe if my example was actually too banal or something, there is another example from another student that actually like, oh, that could be an example of that crazy theory. In that sense, then I'm confused again. And that, so the need for not just like I and thou, but also the third and the fourth. I think Geron Kopf wrote a lot also about this. And I mean, already Dogen started talking about the he and the other. Yeah, does that also play a role in your thinking? But then I ask to all three of you, like, have you also thought about the multiplicity of the dialogue and the co-creation, not just between the teacher and the student, but the teacher creates like a bar, creates some space where students can really very much learn from each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, I agree perfectly. The way I do it is when I teach something, I'll teach the concepts and then I'll teach an example. Usually not an example that resolves itself, but I try to disturb them in a sense. Come up with an example that gets them thinking. But what I'll do is I'll usually break them up into groups. And I'm finding, and this hurts me to say, but the older I get, even if I think my examples are relatable, they're not relatable anymore. I'm getting too damned old. And I'm not that old anyway. So, um, so I break them up into groups, and usually just two or three, and then they just talk to each other. And I find that the making real actually happens when you get them to talk about it. No matter how good my idea is, if they don't get to talk about it, it doesn't connect. And then they'll talk to each other, and then what I'll do is I'll have them, I'll just call on certain groups, and hey, what came up in your group? You don't have to say who said what, but just what came up. And then what I'll do is I'll basically facilitate working through the examples. So I'll say, okay, this part of the example, I think that really connects to what I'm trying to talk about. I wonder where this part is going, so this might be a misunderstanding, so I try to catch the parts where they reduce it to their own experience. So in a sense, you have there um a plurality of I-DAO relations. One of the things I want to point out is I don't do this one-on-one. I have 50 students in a class. But when you give an example, I look at my students. I am totally, totally watching my students because I know that I am not talking to an abstraction. I am talking to an experiential body. And so I look at their faces. I want to see, are you disturbed? I'm giving you a disturbing example. Are you getting disturbed? I am always watching my students. So sometimes people say, how can you do this? I mean, if you have a big classroom, and I'm like, why not? I mean, just because there are 100 people doesn't mean they don't have faces anymore. Look at their faces, it's 100 IDAL relationships just between you and them. And then there's the IDAL relationship between them when they talk to each other. So, yes, but when you get to the third, when you get to the we, I have very mixed feelings about that. I actually try to keep it away from the third because the minute they start to talk, especially in Japan, I struggle with that. At the minute they start to give oh, this is probably the expected answer required by the generalized other, things get ugly. So I keep it as a plurality of IDAO relationships. Yeah. How about you, Takaya Sensei? I mean, maybe this connects to your idea of IDAO. Perhaps you have something to add.
Yeah. So I can answer in some different ways. So if I remain on the philosophical level, Nishida's philosophy develops from I and you relationship into I, you, and he or she and the world, and even the infinite numbers of individuals in the world. So Nishida's philosophy itself develops into more multi-dimensional world. That's a philosophical answer, but I can answer in a more experimental way. So I have a lecture course for more than 100 students, and yes, I can't meet each of the students as I and you, but I have sometimes take a short time for students make pairs, and they can talk to each other and share what they feel about the content of my lecture. So they have hopefully have a I and you relationship between themselves, and then I call them back to my lecture. So that is one way of integrating my course with an I and you relationship. Yeah. So that is my more experimental answer.
Thank you, Takaya-san. I didn't realize your class was so big. That's for the lecture, yeah? The one that you shared with us. Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, Catherine, would you want to add anything? You good?
I think this is from a slightly different lens. I mean,
Sure,
from
sure, sure.
from the point of view of narrative practice, I think it's more of there is that uh, in a sense, a power relationship, power differential between a teacher and a student. And I think a lot of it is also kind of like the teacher being able to sort of um, set the atmosphere in a way that they're able to talk about their own experiences in a way that doesn't call on to a this is the expected answer. And I guess part of it is also kind of like being able to have a sense of openness and vulnerability on the part of the teacher as well. Maybe sharing something that is maybe a little bit personal is one, but I'm still working on that when I teach, for example, yoga. I instead of me giving an example, I ask a lot of them. Usually, it's just a few people, so I ask them for their own examples, and then also talk about mine, and then hopefully, kind of like try to bring these all together as well. So there are many different ways from all of us, I think, that we can try to like be aware of that dynamic between the students themselves, not just between student and teacher.
Thank you. I think that's the power dynamic is something that's very real, but it's also something we can do something about. So it's very important. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Kadashi-sensei, yoroshiku onegaishimasu.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anton. This is rather a request for additional explanation. And you talked about the sixth stage of building ideas, I guess, right? And I just wondered, even from at the initial sort of a stage of the recognizing a problematic situation, can't we say that we are already in entertaining, having a certain set of sort of implicit ideas, at least? Otherwise, there would not be a recognition of a problematic situation in the first place. So, for also when we think of, and at first, I agree with you actually about the importance of the concrete examples and cases, and I really agree. And for example, when we think of even for example, the idea of reflexive equilibrium, and I think not. So what happens at the sixth stage you refer to is not simply a building ideas, but sort of attempts to rearrange the set of implicit ideas. So that was the way I understood. So I wonder if you, in terms of the Dewey and Pragmatis and Mori's philosophy, and if I would appreciate it if you could if you could elaborate a little bit more about the relationship between the ideals and the problems.
Thank you. That I still remember, but you are one of the few teachers I had in Japan who really used examples a lot. I remember you talking about the cherry tree outside Kobe University. But yeah, it's very hard for me to answer this because it's a very tricky point. So on one hand, um, yes, when you already have ideals, just like when you already have a sense of identity or already have a sense of personal values, that affects what you see as a problem. That affects how you encounter everything, like how you set up your hypothesis, how you set up the experiment, what you will look for with the conclusions. The whole process of scientific experimentation will be shaped by your values. But at the same time, I am very I one of the most important points for Dewey and also for Mori was to be careful with purely symbolic problems. For example, if I have a student who acts disrespectfully and I get very, very angry because let's say I think, oh, this person, I'm a professor, how dare you talk to me like that? Is there really a problem? And so basically, one of the challenges that Dewey was pointing out is that a lot of things we think are problems are actually simply forms of symbolic incoherence, but there are actually no actual problems. So sometimes the reason why a student is rude is because he's so excited about an idea that you just gave him. And he kind of forgets to be respectful, you know what I mean? And so sometimes you don't have a problem. But because we're so caught up in, this is my role, this is my position, this is what you're supposed to do. So in contextual behavioral science, they call that fusion, where we start treating, basically most of our problems become made up. Um, and I think one of the things, so when Dewey talks about it, how we think, he talks about the idola, the different problems of how we think. I think that was one of the things that he directly warns against. Yeah. So I do think ideas should shape the way we see problems, but there's a good way for that to happen and a bad way for that to happen. And so I guess I'm just warning about the bad way that that could happen too. But about the reorganization part, 100% I agree with that. Yeah. Does that make sense, Sensei? I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I do. But especially when we think of a pragmatic tradition, needed to say, especially the case of Charles Peirce, his idea of abduction
Yes.
started with a very concrete case, right?
Yes.
So, so I really I agree your viewpoint and your this frustration too.
Yeah, but I think you're right. But the idea of abduction would really help there because it's not pure induction. So there has to be an existing idea also. That's very helpful. I'll keep that in mind. Maybe I can refine the argument. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sebastian,
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for the wonderful presentations. And well, I wanted to bring back something about the examples and the symbolic that in both in Greek philosophy and in German philosophy like Schlegel or Schelling, they bring back another idea of symbolism that is not abstract symbolism. It's more related to like Plato when he presents examples. He gives two kinds of examples, like geometric examples, like the line or the circle, that Nishida also uses this kind of the sphere that has the center everywhere and nowhere. They are geometric, infinite symbolism, but they also use mythological symbolism or artistic, like Kimura with the sculpture. And Plotinus also used this symbol of creating yourself as a statue. So this kind of bringing back the artistic, like Schelling would say, no, the organ of philosophy is art. So that will be another possibility to go beyond the rationalistic interpretation of symbol, because this idea of also Plotinus says the hieroglyphics are like a non-discursive image. And I think that in Japan and in Asia, the kanji is a great way of thinking in this way, because when you say mushin, you have the kokoro kanji, or emptiness is sora, is also the heaven. So it's a good way of thinking in another way, in images or other artistic. So that was, what do you think of this, if it's possible in classrooms to do this?
Thank you. I think this is very interesting. Just very quick answer, and then I want to pass it on to Catherine and Takaya because I think they might be better equipped to answer this. But what you tell me reminds me of Dilthey. It reminds me basically of the difference between rational versus more narrative forms of symbolic or use of thinking. And I guess there is a way to use words that does not escape into the clouds, but that is directly about tying together and calling back to direct experiences that people have. And you're right, I think there's a story factor to the kanji. And I think that can be helpful in a sense. The pictures tell a story, which is why the calligraphy can be very interesting. Yeah. Catherine, this is closer to your narrative work. Perhaps you have a word for this?
Thank you so much for the comment. I think well, it was very helpful for me in thinking about what narrative is based on, which is like that idea of there are multiple perspectives to reality, that there is no one reality. So things like stories, when we talk about the stories, it's like what would this be in one person's perspective, and can it be another way, another person's perspective, but both of them can be true. I think there's many ways that maybe you could use that in education, for one stories. When you have a story, for example, when we taught a class together, we asked people to give them their stories, but we also inquired further about their stories. So when you did this, what happened? And did it get stronger, or what got weaker? So you kind of like flesh out. You don't just leave a story as it is, but you just also inquire after it. And other people I know have used, for example, poetry also as in a sense, it's words, but then it's also very rich and it's very ambiguous, and people have different meanings. And when they talk about it, then I think a lot of different interesting things also come out. So there's still many ways to use something symbolic, and just not let it be left as symbolic. The important thing for me is to connect it again back to some kind of concrete experience that people can, think about and relate with their lives.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm aware of the time and I know that it's over, but I feel very bad if we stopped without talking about Takaya's question, because I think this is one of the most important questions for, well, me personally, perhaps I'll have to wrestle with for the rest of my life. But what is the relation? Takaya Sensei was asking, what is the relationship between the doing part of education for self-awareness for Jikaku versus the being part? And I think this also connects to what Catherine is working on with Nishihira Sensei's work. So perhaps we could, just end with this point if you don't mind. But yeah, me, just initial thoughts. This is, to be honest, this is a bit of this is me at my limit, you know. So I think you can probably guess from how I talk today. I'm a very energetic person. I try to change everything. I try to fix everything. I like to find problems and destroy them. Um, and my book has a very vigorous tone. It's always a question of what is wrong and what can you do. And I think that is very important. That's why I wrote the book. But at the same time, I am aware that it's one-sided. It's a bit one-sided. There are interesting negative reactions to my book. One of the things that I found is that my book makes certain people feel very defensive. It makes people feel like they don't do enough as teachers, like they're insufficient. And I think that comes from the fact that I stress too much the doing rather than what calls you to the doing. Some people also get, everything becomes a project. Like, okay, so how are we going to measure this? Okay, so how are we curriculumized this, and I think again that comes from the overstress of the doing. So yeah, so that's what I see is coming from the doing side. But I was wondering, Takaya Sensei, what are your initial thoughts? I mean, what do you think the being part would add um to this approach? I mean, perhaps it's very different from what I just said, which was more doing side. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if my part is completely about being. So Nishida did respond to Kimura. So that's also his doing, education for awakening. But maybe you can say Nishida is not requiring Kimura to do something more, but just realize that he is already beginning to be awakening. So then Nishida is just waiting for Kimura's self-awakening. So maybe that is a side of being for Nishida and Kimura also.
Like this faith that even if the person is mumyo in the middle of darkness, that the jikaku, the self-awareness is already operating within them. Yeah. And I think that's a very important thing, but also it's something that I struggle with. It's very hard for me to see. Catherine, any thoughts about this? You also see this overall flow, and I feel like as with your work with art and yoga, you are much more in touch with a less violent way of looking at the world than me.
I guess this is a more pragmatic look at perspective that maybe is more closer to Mead and Dewey and perhaps even Nishida and Mori in that sense. But I see it a lot there, that idea of emergence, that there's something there that you have something that you're already here in front of you and you're trying to solve that. But is there a way to kind of like leave yourself open to like whatever new questions that will arise on while you're doing something? And I guess when you're too fixed on the goal, when you're not able to also open yourself to questions, that's when it gets a little too fixed and it becomes all about doing. In that sense, that's the receptive part. Can I be open to, I guess, the questions? A lot of times when I make art, for example, it's never going to turn out the way that I think it is. It's never. I've never had that happen. But basically, how do I respond to this new thing, this new problem that I have right in front of me? Well, this new situation that I have in front of me. And in a sense, it's asking you to find that good rhythm between doing and being. And to your point with Mori, I think we have different levels. So what if in a sense you are doing something on this level, but can you be more being mode on a different level? For example, accepting somebody from a more organic sense. Will that actually change something on the whole system? So in a sense, there are, I guess, many ways to kind of like tackle this doing and being even on different levels.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that cleared up some of your question, Takaya. Did that kind of answer your question?
Yes, maybe.
Good.
So I'm interested in more these ideas of different levels of different layers, and we are living all the layers at the same time in tension. So this idea is very interesting to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So just one really small thing, and then we can close this. But an example Catherine already gave, she was talking about yoga and teaching yoga, and I realized there's something yoga teachers can do that I can never do as a teacher, which is she works directly on the body. And so in a sense, she can do work directly on the Seitai So. And as you're stretching, as you're feeling tension in certain parts, as you're starting to shake, in a sense, there's a question of how you interpret that, what you connect it to, how you give meaning to that, how you relax into it. And that's something that I cannot, as a teacher, I do not touch my students physically. You know what I mean? So in a sense, we touch people on different levels. And well, when I do therapy, I don't use philosophical ideas. And so in a sense, that's straight to Jikaku-so, no Ishiki-so. But as a philosophy teacher, I'm really operating primarily on Ishiki-so on the conscious level, but I'm still trying to affect the other two. So it's interesting. And I think there's a lot to think about here. But yes, again, interesting, but I'm still on the level of doing. So I think the level of being is something I'll always have to think about. Okay, so thank you everyone. We're 10 minutes over, but thank you so much for joining us today. And it's great to see some Hisashiburi faces. And thank you. And I hope you got something out of our panel discussion today. ありがとうございました。